Hi everyone. Today we're going to be reviewing Chapter 12, the Second War for American Independence, which is the War of 1812 and the nationalism that followed. In the War of 1812, the regular army that the Americans had was ill-trained, ill-disciplined, and scattered, and supplemented by the even more poorly trained militias. And some generals were very old and had participated in the Revolutionary War. Now, Canada was an important battleground because the British forces were weakest there, and so Americans turned their attention there first. This is a map showing the different engagements of the War of 1812. You can pause and view the map. Now, Canada had a very, like I said, was the first place that Americans turned towards the War of 1812, and their offensive strategy was very poorly conceived. They missed their opportunity by not capturing Montreal. Instead, they led a three-pronged invasion, invading forces from Detroit, Niagara, and Lake Champlain. All these forces were defeated soon after crossing the Canadian border, but in contrast, the British and the Canadians had great energy and quickly captured American forts in the area. Americans then looked for success on the water. The American Navy did much better than the Army. American crafts were better than the British ships. The example is the USS Constitution, which had thicker sides, heavier firepower, and larger crews. The control of the Great Lakes was vital, and an energetic American officer named Oliver Hazard Perry managed to build a fleet. Perry's victory on Lake Erie was infused new life into the American cause, and the Redcoats were forced from Detroit and Fort Malden and then beaten at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813. Despite these successes, Americans by the late 1814 were far from invading Canada. There were thousands of Redcoat veterans who began to pour into Canada from the continent, and with 10,000 troops, the British prepared for war in 1814 against New York along a lake river route. So lacking roads, the invaders were forced to bring supplies over Lake Champlain and the waterway. The American fleet, commanded by Thomas Mackindaw, challenged the British. This was a desperate battle that was fought near Plattsburgh on September 11, 1814. The results of the American victory were momentous. The British Army was forced to retreat. Macdonough saved the upper New York from conquest, and this affected the concurrent negotiations of Anglo-American peace treaty in Europe. This is a picture that gives a description about the engagement between the Constitution and the Guerre. You can pause and read it for yourself. Now, Washington was burned, and New Orleans was defended also during this war. So a second British force of 4,000 landed in the Chesapeake Bay area in August of 1814. They were marching toward Washington, and they dispersed 6,000 militiamen at Bladensburg. They set fire to the buildings in Washington, including the Capitol building and the White House. This is a political cartoon that we looked at in class that's titled The Fall of Washington, or Maddie in Full Flight. You can pause to read the description. The Americans at Baltimore, however, held firm. The British hammered Fort McHenry, but were unable to take the city, and this is where Francis Scott Key was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner. A third British assault in 1814 was aimed at New Orleans and menaced the entire Mississippi Valley. Andrew Jackson, who was fresh from the victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, was in command in this battle. Jackson had 7,000 soldiers holding defensive positions, and there were 8,000 British soldiers that blundered this battle badly. They launched a frontal assault on January 8, 1815, suffered the most devastating defeat of the entire war, lost over 2,000 killed and wounded in a half an hour, and it was an astonishing victory for Andrew Jackson and his men. News of the American victory in the Battle of New Orleans was a great encouragement. In actuality, this battle didn't even have to take place because it took place 2 weeks after the treaty had originally been signed, but word had not yet reached America. At the Treaty of Ghent, Tsar Alexander I of Russia proposed mediation in 1812. His proposal brought 5 American peacemakers to the Belgian city of Ghent in 1814. The group was headed by John Quincy Adams. Confident from early military successes, the British initially demanded a neutralized Indian buffer state in the Great Lakes region. They wanted control of the Great Lakes and of a substantial part of Maine. Americans flatly rejected these terms and talks were stalemated. The British reverses in the upper New York and Baltimore areas made London more willing to compromise, and England also was preoccupied with redrafting the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna and eyeing still dangerous France. So at the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed on Christmas Eve in 1814, this was essentially an armistice by this point. New England extremists proposed secession when they aired their Federalist grievances at the Hartford Convention, and really discussed even having a separate peace with Britain. So at the Hartford Convention, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island sent full delegations. New Hampshire and Vermont sent partial delegations. 26 men met in secrecy for 3 weeks. Remember, these were the Federalists at the Hartford Convention. And on December 15, 1814 to January 5, 1815, to discuss the grievances over the embargo and the War of 1812. Only a few delegates actually advocated secession. This is a political cartoon we also talked about that's about the Hartford Convention. We discussed it in class, so please review the description. The Hartford Convention was not radical. The convention's final report was fairly moderate. The demands reflected the Federalist fears that New England was becoming subservient to the South and West. They demanded financial assistance from Washington to compensate for the lost trade from the embargo and the War of 1812, and they proposed constitutional amendments requiring 2/3 of a vote in Congress before an embargo could be imposed, new states admitted, or war declared. Delegates sought to abolish the 3/5 clause as well, and also to limit presidents to a single term. They also sought to prohibit the election of 2 successive presidents from the same state, which was aimed at the Virginia dynasty. 3 envoys carried these demands to Washington. They arrived just as news of New Orleans and the victory from Andrew Jackson appeared, so the Hartford Convention was actually the death of the Federalist Party. The Federalists never again were able to mount a successful presidential campaign after this. This is a map of the presidential election of 1812. The War of 1812 was a small war. 6,000 Americans were killed or wounded. It was globally unimportant, but the war had huge consequences for the United States. Other nations developed a new respect for America's prowess, thanks to Perry and McDonough, and in a diplomatic sense, the conflict would be called the Second War for American Independence, proving that it wasn't just a fluke that they were successful the first time. Sectionalism was dealt a black eye during this time period, and the Federalists were the most conspicuous casualty. War heroes emerged, such as Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, who would both later become president. Abandoned by the British, the Indians were forced to make the terms that they could with the United States, and in an economic sense, the war bred greater United States independence and increased American manufacturing. Canadian patriotism was also increased by the war. Many felt betrayed by the Treaty of Ghent. They were grieved by the failure to secure the Indian buffer state or even mastery of the Great Lakes. So the Rush-Bagot Agreement in 1817 was signed between the British and the United States, which limited naval armament on the Great Lakes and removed the border fortifications. The United States and Canada began to share at this point the world's longest unfortified boundary, which is 5,527 miles. The most impressive byproduct of the war was heightened nationalism, a national consciousness, or a national oneness. America may not have fought the war as one nation, but it certainly emerged as one. Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, who we spoke about in class, attained international fame as American writers, and so now the arts in America are going to start to pick up speed. The revised Bank of the United States was approved by Congress in 1816. The new national capital began to rise in Washington. The Army was expanded to 10,000. The Navy further covered itself with the victory in 1815 when it beat pirates off the coast of North Africa. Nationalism manifested itself in manufacturing as well, and mostly in representative of Henry Clay's American system, which we talked about in class. The patriotic Americans took pride in factories. The British actually, after the war, tried to crush the U.S. factories in the marketplace by flooding the economy with American goods. And in response to that, the Tariff of 1816 was passed. It was the first tariff. It was primarily for protection of American products, not revenue. The rates were 20 to 25% the value of dutiable imports, and it was a highly protective tariff, and a trend of these is going to begin. Nationalism, highlighted by Henry Clay's plan for developing a system profitable for the home market, was called the American system. This involved a strong banking system to provide easy credit, a protective tariff for Eastern manufacturing, a network of roads and canals, especially in Ohio, which would meet the need for better transportation. And spending for this plan conflicted with the Republican constitutional scruples, so there's going to be debate. This is a picture of Henry Clay. His American system of protective tariffs for Eastern manufacturers and federally financed canals and highways to benefit the West were one of the compromises, or one of the policies that Henry Clay contributed in his career in the Congress. Congress voted in 1817 to distribute $1.5 million to states for internal improvements, which are roads, bridges, canals. President Monroe vetoed the measure as unconstitutional. He said individual states had to fund their own construction, including the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. Jeffersonian Republicans rejected direct federal support for interstate internal improvements, and New England strongly opposed it because it would further drain away the population from New England and create competing states in the West. This is a nationalist pride painting that was created as a result of the rising nationalism in the United States. We did a short answer question on this in class, so you can just review the description. James Monroe was nominated for the presidency in 1816. This was the last time a Federalist would run. Monroe, who was an experienced, level-headed executive, was running during a time when emerging nationalism was present, and so he did a goodwill tour in 1817, which got him a lot of press and support. The Boston newspaper had announced at this point an era of good feelings, because really, mostly the political parties were kind of agreeing on the same things during this time period. In the era of good feelings, this was considerable tranquility and prosperity that did exist in the early Monroe years, but it also shows an underlying time where there's a lot of trouble within the United States. There was an extensive debate over the tariff, over the bank, over internal improvements, and the sale of public lands, and sectionalism in the United States is growing. The debate over slavery is also growing as well. So the Panic of 1819 and the Curse of Hard Times basically happens during the era of good feelings. This was a time of deflation, bankruptcies, bank failures, unemployment, and overcrowded debtors' prisons. The factors that contributed to the economic panic was overspeculation of frontier land, and the West was hard hit when the Bank of the United States forced Western banks to foreclose on farm mortgages. In the Panic of 1819, the poorer classes were hit very hard. This is actually going to sow the seeds of Jacksonian democracy. It called attention to the inhumanity of imprisoning debtors, and agitation against imprisonment for debt results in remedial legislation in many states. In the West, 9 states joined the original 13 between 1791 and 1819. So to keep the balance between the North and South, the states were admitted alternately, free and slave. This was a continuation of a generation-old movement west. Land was cheap, newcomers were very eager and coming from abroad, and tobacco land was becoming exhausted in the South. Other causes of the growing West was an acute economic distress during the embargo years. Indians in the Northwest and South were crushed by the generals Harrison and Jackson. New highways improved land routes to Ohio and to the Ohio River Valley. The example of that is the Cumberland Road in 1811. And in 1811, the first steamboat on the western waters heralded a new era of upstream navigation. The West was still weak in population and influence, but it allied with other sections to gain influence. So when the Land Act of 1820 was passed, it helped with access to land, and it allowed people to buy 80 acres at a minimum of $1.25 an acre in cash. An acre is about the size of a football field. The West demanded that the government fund transportation and slowly received it, and the West was also frustrated by the Bank of the United States and the resistance to allowing them to get easy credit. The North and South tensions over the West were revealed in 1819. Missouri petitioned for statehood. The Talmadge Amendment attempted to be passed, which would have not allowed more slaves to be brought into Missouri and would have gradually emancipated the children born to slaves that were already there. The roar of anger from the slave-holding Southerners was very loud. They saw the Talmadge Amendment as a threat to sectional balance and the whole future of slavery. If Congress had abolished the peculiar institution in Missouri, it might do so in the older states of the South, and that was their fear. A few Northerners protested the evils of slavery and were determined to prevent its spread into the territories. Henry Clay broke the deadlock with 3 compromises. In Congress, they admitted Missouri as a slave state, and then Maine as a free state, which kept the balance between the North and South. They prohibited slavery north of the 3630 parallel, which is the southern boundary of Missouri, and this is called the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise can be seen here detailed on the map. You may pause and read the description. The Missouri Compromise lasted for 34 years and was vital in the formative period in the young republic. It preserved the compact of states. It exposed the divisive issue of slavery in the West. But the Missouri Compromise and the Panic of 1819 should have hurt Monroe's re-election of 1820, but Monroe received every electoral vote except one because the Federalists were so weak during this time period. The Supreme Court, during this time, under the Chief Justice John Marshall, also bolstered nationalism in the United States. McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819 strengthened the U.S. government at the expense of the states. Maryland attempted to destroy the Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on its notes, and Marshall declared the bank unconstitutional using the doctrine of implied powers or loose construction. He increased federal authority when he denied the right of Maryland to tax the bank. In Cohens v. Virginia in 1821, Marshall had another opportunity to defend federal power. The Cohen brothers were convicted by Virginia courts of illegally selling lottery tickets. They appealed the conviction to the Supreme Court. The court upheld the conviction, and Marshall asserted the right of the Supreme Court to review decisions of state courts in all questions involving powers of the federal government. In Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, the New York State granted a monopoly of waterborne commerce between New York and New Jersey to a private concern. Marshall asserted that the Constitution conferred on Congress alone control of interstate commerce, and this struck a blow at states' rights while upholding the sovereign powers of the federal government. Marshall also protected property rights in the notorious case of Fletcher v. Peck in 1810. The Georgia legislature granted 35 million acres in the Yazoo River country of Mississippi to private speculators. Next, the legislature canceled the corrupt transaction. The court decreed a contract, and the Constitution forbids states from impairing contracts. So this protected the property rights against popular pressures. Fletcher, in Fletcher v. Peck, that decision enabled the court to assert the right to void state laws conflicting with the federal Constitution. And in Dartmouth College v. Woodward in 1819, the college sued when New Jersey changed the charter, which had been granted to the college by the king in 1869. In Dartmouth College v. Woodward, Marshall ruled the original charter must stand. It was a contract, and Constitution is protecting of contracts against state encroachments. In Dartmouth, the decision safeguarded businesses from the domination by the states, and it created a future problem when corporations escaped needed public control. If Marshall was the molding father of the Constitution, then Daniel Webster was the expounding father. He expounded the nationalistic philosophy and challenged the states' rights and nullification. Daniel Webster was a representative from Massachusetts. Marshall's nationalistic decisions shaped U.S. history. It buttressed the federal union, created a stable national environment for businesses, checked the excesses of elected state legislatures, shaped the Constitution along conservative centralizing lines, counter to the emerging democratic spirit of the era, and through him, the Hamiltonians partly triumphed. At the Anglo-American Convention in 1818, the United States was permitted to share Newfoundland fisheries with Canada. A fixed, vague northern limits of Louisiana along the 49th parallel from the Lake of the Woods, Minnesota, to the Rocky Mountains was established, and it provided for a 10-year joint occupation of the Oregon Territory without the surrender of rights or claims to either America or Britain. This is a picture of the U.S. and British boundary settlements in 1818. You can pause and review it. Semitropical Spanish Florida was also an issue. The Americans had already claimed West Florida, which had been ratified by Congress in 1812, but the bulk of Florida remained under Spanish rule. There were uprisings in South America that forced Spain to remove its troops from Florida. Jackson secured a commission to enter the Spanish territory, and this is where Andrew Jackson becomes important because he's fighting Indian raids that are coming from Spanish Florida. This is a map of the territories that we're discussing. Okay, so exceeding his instructions, Jackson swept across Florida, attacking Indians without any who assisted them. Monroe consulted his cabinet and really wanted to discipline Jackson, except for John Quincy Adams. Out of this comes the Florida Purchase Treaty in 1819, which is also known as the Adamsonis Treaty. Spain cedes Florida to the United States and its claims to Oregon in exchange for Texas. The autocrats of Europe, basically during this time period, stated that the world must be made safe from democracy. So they were smothering rebellions in Italy in 1821 and in Spain in 1823. The Americans became alarmed as a result. If the Europeans interfered in the New World, republicanism would suffer irreparable harm, and the physical security of the United States, the mother of democracy, would be endangered. Russia's push from Alaska began when the Tsar in 1821 claimed jurisdiction over 100 miles of open sea to the 51st parallel, which is most of British Columbia. Russia had trading posts as far in as San Francisco Bay, and the Americans feared that Russia would block access to California, which was a prospective U.S. window to the Pacific. England wanted the United States to issue a joint pledge asserting territorial integrity of the New World. Adams concluded that a self-denying alliance with Britain would hamper American expansion and was unnecessary. He suspected England would block any European intervention in South America. So now John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State for James Monroe, and this is how the Monroe Doctrine comes about. This is a picture of Monroe and his cabinet, and you can read the description. So the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 is issued by James Monroe. In his annual message to Congress, he issues his stern warning to Europe, which says non-colonization and non-intervention in the Western Hemisphere. He discusses regarding Russia's advance in the Northwest. He proclaims an era of colonization over, and he warns against foreign intervention, especially in the South. So the European powers are offended, but could do very little because the British Navy had other things that it was involved in during this time period. So this is where Monroe says, stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and we'll stay out of the Eastern Hemisphere. Russia relented even before the doctrine is released. So the Russo-American Treaty was signed in 1824. This fixed Russia's southern line at the 5440 parallel, which is the present south tip of the Alaska Panhandle. The Monroe Doctrine might have more accurately been called the Self-Defense Doctrine. Monroe was concerned about the security of his own country as well as the budding nations in Latin America. This is a picture of the West and Northwest. You can read the description when you pause the video. Monroe Doctrine has never been greater than Americans' power to eject a trespasser. So this was never really law, domestic or international. It was merely a personalized statement of policy by President Monroe that expressed the post-1812 nationalism of the emerging United States. And this is the chronology from the chapter.